Our next speaker is Amanda Stahl, who is a researcher at Washington State University with specialties in riparian ecology and policy, remote sensing, and GIS. She develops innovative techniques for mapping and analyzing spatial patterns in policy, social capacity, and ecosystem functions associated with riparian conservation. Her work aims to facilitate effective communication among the scientific disciplines conducting riparian-related research, as well as the flow of information among researchers, decision makers, and conservation practitioners. Prior to earning her PhD in environmental and natural resource sciences at Washington State University, she received a bachelor's in geology and biology from Brown University and a master's in earth and planetary sciences from the University of New Mexico. Dr. Stahl has nearly 15 experience tailoring interactive earth, environmental, and natural resource science courses to engage diverse undergraduates. In her free time, she enjoys outdoor adventures with her family, gardening, and whitescaping with native loose plants. So from here, Amanda, I'll let you take it from here. Thanks.
I think we've still got you on mute there, Amanda, which I think you're self-muted. There we go.
Okay.
Yeah, great. We can hear you now and see your screen.
Excellent.
Perfect.
Okay.
That looks great.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here today. Oops. Apologies. There we go. Sorry about that. Technical issues. So I'm here today to talk about some potentially practical remote sensing workflows for ecosystem monitoring. And what I'll be talking about today is a research project that started in 2019 when I was a PhD student at WSU. And this is a partnership with the Palouse Conservation District. And I wanted to mention here from the beginning that this work was to try to start scoping out where there are some gaps in monitoring that could potentially be filled with remote sensing approaches. And we focused on Eastern Washington and on riparian areas or naturally vegetated areas. And that work continues, but I am also involved in work in forest ecosystems and mapping tillage practices now. There are many other potential applications, so I would encourage everyone to think of this as an idea starter, and please, if any questions or ideas come up or you have experience that you would like to share, I'd be really glad to talk about that in the Q&A session at the end. So just to go over what I have planned for today, first we'll talk a bit about how to find imagery to fit monitoring needs. And the idea here is that we're complementing ground-based monitoring strategies. There's nothing that can take the place of walking through a site in the field, talking with the person who's been taking care of it, taking measurements of plants. But as we all know, policy funding sources require that we can monitor and report how ecosystems are doing at larger scales than the site, and remotely sensed imagery offers capabilities to string together those individual actions into a landscape level outcome. We'll talk about what we can do potentially with access to free imagery and cloud computing platforms, how they sort of change the game for using remote sensing. We'll talk a bit about when drones are useful for ecosystem monitoring and when they may not be, so some of the limitations of that as well. And just starting to really get into what is involved in implementing remote sensing approaches to monitoring. I know a lot of conservation districts across the state have already been using remote sensing in various ways. And there are also some potential opportunities, but what would be involved in actually getting that into practice, and would it be worthwhile? We're starting to get in that direction. So the first question we asked was, can image analysis add to our monitoring toolbox? Let's not assume that remote sensing has ways to fill our gaps. Let's figure out what are those potential, where are the potential opportunities, and is there something there that's worth pursuing? And the answer really is it depends on whether there's imagery available or what the cost of the imagery is. what is the scale of the change that we are seeing on the landscape on the ground that we want to capture with remote sensing? And when I talk about scale, I mean both the grain and the extent of change. That is really critical to determining whether there's imagery available or whether we can collect imagery that's going to help do what we need to do. And really critical also is the timing of the change that we see on the landscape, and what is that timing compared to when images were captured. And I'll give you some examples to show what we're talking about. And I'll start out here by talking about NAEP imagery and Landsat imagery because they have been around longer, and many more counties or conservation districts in Washington I know are using some of these image sources. So NAEP is the National Agricultural Imagery Program. They've been collecting images over some forested areas and agricultural areas since 2003. It has 1 meter spatial resolution on the ground, and return interval could be about 3 to 5 years. It depends on the place. Landsat imagery offers us a great historical archive because it's been flying since 1980. But the ground resolution is 30 meters, and if you think about a 30 by 30 meter square, that really blurs out a lot of the things that we want to detect and represent on the ground, so there are some limitations there. The return interval is 16 days for an individual satellite. Sometimes we can get closer if we combine multiple. And so that's a kind of traditionally what's been available. To show what those look like, just for those who aren't familiar in this kind of setting, here are examples of some of these NAEP aerial photos from a stream in eastern Washington. And this stream had a major management change right around the year 2000, where the riparian area, the natural riparian area, started to recover and expand. So in these images I'm showing you, it's a false color image. It's color infrared. And here the bright reds are active green vegetation. And areas that show up green in these images are actually brown. So that might be roads or bare soil or vegetation that's already turned brown at the time the images were collected. And so here, if you look at the area that's in the ovals, I'm guessing maybe you can see my mouse pointer, not sure. The area in the oval is the same area. And you can see that this red strip here has gotten a little bit wider in 2017 compared to 2009. So on the ground, this is a major, pretty large scale riparian rebound, we might say. And so it does show up in the NAEP imagery. This is the same area shown in Landsat imagery, as I mentioned, with the 30 by 30 meter squares. So the riparian area here starts to get pretty fuzzy. We're looking at true color images now from 1999 to 2019 to compare them side by side, and the ovals are the same as in the previous images. And these are composite images. So basically we take all the available images from late July and August where clouds aren't in the way and collapse them all down to a single image. It's basically an average for that time. And out in eastern Washington, the riparian areas really pop out at that time of year because surrounding areas are pretty brown in comparison. So it's really hard to tell, even with a major management change and riparian recovery. We might be able to come up with something there, but it's kind of, we're at the finer limit of what we can get with this type of imagery. When I look at a color infrared, like the one on the previous slide, you see this red in the oval here. So it does start to capture some of that riparian recovery. And then I also wanted to show this image as NDVI. For those who aren't familiar, it's the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. It basically collapses all the information in this color infrared down into a single band. So we can look at it and say the areas that are brighter white here are more active vegetation at this time of year. In the 2019 at the bottom, then in the 1999 at the top. I also wanted to mention and give an example of what I was talking about with these timing issues that we sometimes run into. And that is that, oops, I'm sorry, I have minimized the wrong part of my screen. In this image of Whitman County, we're looking at these NAEP aerial images that are available from a certain year. And you'll notice that there are blank areas here where there were no images collected, a blank area here where there was no image, and then this area here that looks strangely greener than the rest, and that's because this area was flown and imaged at a different time of the growing season than the rest of the county. In some areas, this may be less of an issue, but where we have strong seasonality during the growing season, the moisture availability changes a lot. And so if one area was flown in June and the other in August or October, then it becomes hard to use this for larger scale monitoring because we're comparing apples to oranges in a way. So this is where I was saying timing can be an issue. And so the question is, can some of the new image sources that are more recently available help add to the monitoring toolbox, fill in some of the gaps that were left by the earlier available imagery in NAIP and Landsat? And so we'll talk a bit about drones today. Drones can give us much finer than 1 meter resolution on the ground. We can essentially fly them on demand and get site-by-site information. Now, I'll mention here that the processing software and the processing workflow is not trivial working with drones, and we'll get into some of those details when we get to that. But I want to start by talking about Sentinel imagery, which is really promising, particularly for riparian and natural vegetation monitoring. It's freely available imagery worldwide since 2016 at 10 meter resolution, so quite a bit finer than Landsat, and a 5-day time interval for return. So it starts to give us a lot more capability than Landsat for this type of vegetation monitoring. We paired it with cloud computing to try to figure out what is freely available, that's quickly available, that could really help to fill some monitoring gaps. So to give you a sense, this is the Google Earth Engine platform. It's a web interface, and it's one of the prime examples of cloud computing that's available for remote sensing these days. It starts with a blank map, but whatever outputs you get from the code you put in will show up on this map here on the bottom. Whatever scripts you compose are organized in the left panel here, and then each one will have a certain amount of code. In this case, it's using JavaScript right here in the code editor, and then whatever comes out will be over here on the right. Now, to give an example of what this means and how it's different than traditional remote sensing with desktop computing, is once we have a code written, we can generate maps for counties or larger areas in about 5 to 10 minutes. We can extract data from the remotely sensed images without having to download those images. That means a difference between maybe taking a week to download, process, and stitch images individually, and then, compare a week to maybe a few minutes. Algorithms that we compose can be shared and easily modified here in this scripts organizer. And then we can also generate apps where the map output is packaged for folks who don't want to get into the coding, and we can just make that publicly available in a user-friendly platform. So the question is, how is this relevant for ecosystem monitoring? Well, we took a look at this and said, if we can all get together and pool the knowledge of what's happening on the ground with the knowledge of the capabilities with existing data and cloud computing platforms, can we put this all together in a co-production process to get some more information out that would be useful for evaluating the effectiveness of individual restoration actions and best management practices in a larger landscape context in a way that's relevant to policy? And we developed a series of steps. We sort of distilled this out through the process while we were working it out. And these steps are first to say, what questions can we answer with available imagery? Start analyzing and see what we can come up with. Then say, what's the accuracy and where are the uncertainties in that type of analysis? And then interact with folks who are involved in reporting and adaptive management, find out, how is this applicable or not? How can we change it to make it more applicable? Or should we just abandon ship because this isn't useful at all? And then if we get past that stage and say, hey, there's something potentially really useful here, then where are the challenges and opportunities for systematically bringing this into existing programs so that we can have repeated monitoring going forward, running the same scripts or the same process on new imagery as it becomes available? And so in our case, we started looking at the Voluntary Stewardship program. Again, this was a partnership with the Police Conservation District. And so we focused on Eastern Washington, and we were looking at detecting land cover change at watershed scales and maintaining the privacy of producers. We looked at distinguishing natural variability, particularly in moisture availability and how that affects the plants through the growing season, distinguishing that from the impacts of management. And we systematically went through to minimize the area that would require further investigation, thinking we can't visit every site on the ground. So is there some way we can use this where we have imagery everywhere to target the areas for further investigation? And then if it was all successful, to work on a plan to transfer this capability for broader use by staff at conservation districts or other personnel. And so we focused on the Whitman-Garfield County areas and the overlapping watersheds. Starting with asking the question, what's the best available imagery? So here we're looking at critical area monitoring, and we have to report at watershed to county scales. So medium resolution satellite imagery is a good fit for this. Medium resolution is the Sentinel Landsat area. We need something that's fine enough to detect our narrow vegetated strips along riparian areas and frequent enough to capture the changes within and across seasons to detect that moisture availability and go back to 2011. So we found that Sentinel-2 was the best fit. It is kind of that balance between having the fine enough resolution, temporal and spatial resolution. Unfortunately, it doesn't go all the way back to 2011, which is a challenge for the first VSP monitoring round. Just to give you a sense of the difference between Sentinel and Landsat pixels, they're both fuzzy squares when it comes to looking at a narrow river corridor, but you can see the Palouse River is less detectable in the Landsat image than in the Sentinel image. So really Sentinel is just giving us enough resolution to start detecting riparian areas and compare them over time. So here we use the Earth engine as an example to classify vegetation by the timing of when it turns brown in the growing season. And so we use that NDVI. It's the same index I talked about before, where the bright white is active plants. So you can see the areas that are forested, even here at the end of the growing season, mid-August through September, they're still bright white. And we can see these bright areas along riparian areas that are also bright white through the growing season. Everything else is gray that's turned brown. We trained the computer to automatically classify and recognize these areas so that it can map them out as simply whether they're green or brown at the end of the growing season. Then once we have that model, we can produce maps for the whole area in less than 10 minutes and then run it over different time frames. To give you a sense of the finer spatial resolution, Earth Engine saves memory by running the script at a screen appropriate resolution. So when you zoom in, you do get much finer resolution. I just wanted to show that as an example. And so here we ran the same classifier over the 4 different years of imagery we had available at the time, 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019. So we're simply saying at the end of the growing season, what is still green and what's brown? Then we can go through and say, okay, where are the places that are pretty much the same at this time of year? Which ones are always green, which ones are always brown? Those would be green and yellow, respectively. And then what are the places that are sometimes green, sometimes brown? Because those might be really interesting for monitoring. And so those will turn up magenta. And we map this for the whole area. I'm just using an excerpt here so you can zoom in and see the detail. And you see some areas have a lot of this magenta kind of in thin strips along the stream. Those are likely due to natural variability. The areas where there's a really stark contrast with a square shape to it, probably due to practices in square parcels, and we've seen round ones in irrigated fields as well. So here we can start to systematically go through and say this much of the landscape is changing, here's why it might be changing, and then we need ground truthing to really determine what's happening here, and we've started with that process. So as far as where we are in the process, we are still evaluating the accuracy, applicability, and highlighting some of the challenges and opportunities of using this. Getting back to our co-production idea. So our classification accuracies, so these are evaluated internally, and the model are more than 90% for recognizing those green versus brown areas. The maps that we've output have helped to support VSP reporting in 2 counties already, and I've been able to do a preliminary habitat corridor analysis mapping potential areas for connectivity for the Palouse Conservation District. And we're starting to think about how we can adapt this approach to fit other monitoring needs that have broader applicability, both in this part of Washington, and also in other parts of Washington and other settings. And we're starting to ask the question, what are the most useful and feasible ways to transfer these capabilities to conservation districts? So for example, we're working on a prototype app, and we're hosting all this information online to try to get some input feedback. We'd love to have other folks try to use this and tell us what's useful, what's not, what else might be useful, and how can we make it really feasible to use. So just to review in a nutshell, I know it can be hard to keep track of what benefits are associated with what aspect here. So just focusing on Google Earth Engine as a cloud computing platform, it takes available satellite imagery, we put in the algorithms, it gives us some applications. So the advantages we have found so far is it gives us quick and easy access to a lot of different data sets, many more than I talked about today, land cover data, climate data, all kinds of things like that. Requires minimal storage and computational power, so I did all this just with a regular laptop. There's no need to go through downloading, projecting, and mosaicing these big images, which takes tons of storage space and could take a couple of weeks just to do one area one time. And then by sharing repositories and apps, potentially we can share this, work together, and have some really more real-time access to satellite data as it becomes available for folks who are involved in monitoring and reporting. Limitations. There's still a lot of training and experience needed to get into composing scripts, and that's something that potentially we can work together on, but it is something that you know, when everyone has a full workload, it can be hard to budget for. Memory limitations in the current phase of Earth Engine are pretty substantial, so we have to have only a certain amount of information running in a given script, producing a map, that sort of thing. And then some types of processing and analysis are really difficult to produce. At least I found it to be the case in this code editor. And so at some point we would export the data out and then go forward in other software platforms. So just for folks to have this for reference, the way to access Earth Engine is through this URL. One needs to apply and be approved with a Google account if you want to get involved in coding. Other options are available to use Python if you're not familiar with JavaScript, but it can be a little more involved to get up and running with that. And at this point, different types of access and use are available at different costs. As researchers and educational institution, we have free access, but that may not last forever. Oops, sorry. And so that's important to note that we do not know how this would change in the future. So I wanted to make sure I made that clear. Okay, moving on to a little bit about drones and drone-based imagery and what we might be able to do with it. So this gives us really high resolution imagery over small areas, for example, an individual riparian buffer, with the flexibility to collect ecological data when we think it's important for that site. So this could be before and after restoration project at key times of year, looking at certain weeds that tend to take over at certain times of year, that sort of thing. And so what I'll report here is mostly from our pilot study of riparian vegetation. So here we visited 9 different sites across Whitman County and collected a couple different types of drone imagery. So we'll talk about what are some of the applications we found from that pilot study, what are the steps involved in working with this, and some of the practical considerations and limitations of these methods. So the first one I'll talk about here on the left, this was using a consumer grade drone setup. So the total cost of this, I think, is about $1,200. It's a GoPro camera mounted on a 3DR Solo, which is a fairly old drone. You'll notice that there are this X made of red and blue. We actually used pool noodles as GPS points. These are called ground control points. And so when we're working with true color imagery, if we use those ground control points and get high resolution GPS, then there's software that can build a 3-dimensional model of the surface. So this uses structure from motion photogrammetry and many, many different pictures of the same thing from different angles and different heights, enables it to build a 3-dimensional model of the surface. The other system we used is a commercial grade drone with a sensor mounted that has 5-band imagery. So it has the red, green, and blue that we find in a true color camera, but also near infrared and red edge bands, which enables us to compute vegetation indices, such as those I showed with the satellite and nape imagery earlier. And so this enables us to get at what plants are there and how green are they. To do this type of imagery, you do not need to place those ground control points or have high resolution GPS, but you do need to have a multispectral sensor. And so to give you a sense of the differences between this setup is thousands of dollars. This one was more like between $1,000 and $1,500. The one on the right, however, we could be in and out of the field in about an hour and process all the imagery in about an hour and get some really interesting outputs. Versus this one is a lower budget setup, but it would take more like 4 to 6 hours in the field and many hours of processing to get a useful output. So just to give folks a sense of how those shake out. A generalized workflow for both of these kinds of methods is first, we need to figure out how we will plan missions, and we use a mission planning software that will depend on whatever drone and sensor setup we have and what we're trying to get out of that site. And then we would fly the mission using a compatible piloting app, which is often different than the software we plan the mission in, and also depends on what system we're flying. But regardless, we'll collect a lot of images, hundreds of images for one of those riparian buffers, for example, at appropriate altitudes with enough overlap and an optimal angle. So the gimbal angle is just whether the camera is pointing straight down at the ground or off at some kind of angle, which will change depending on what we're trying to image. And then if we're going to do the photogrammetry to build a 3-dimensional model, we also need high resolution GPS data. So that could be RTK GPS or differential GPS with control points to make sure that we have accurate measurements. And also if we want to be able to compare from one date to another date, change over time, we need to have that information. Then in our case, we use Agisoft Metashape. That's what our lab has access to for processing software. There are other software packages out there that will do that, and we bring in those GPS points if we have them. This gives us out geo-TIFFs, so geo-referenced stitched images and elevation models of the surface that we can then use in any GIS software. I should also mention that this software builds a dense point cloud, so we can take that out and use LiDAR type algorithms on those also. In this case, we use those outputs to try to see if we could recognize individual types of plants and quantify how green they are, and also look at plant height and habitat structure from the 3-dimensional model. So to give just a sense of how this works in that software, on the upper right here is an example of one image that might be taken. This is just a quick single path flight over a open forested area to give you an example. And so what the software does is first, it places the camera in the sky essentially, based on the GPS information from the drone. So each one of these blue rectangles you're seeing here with a line come out of it is a position of the drone it's the position of the camera when it was taking a picture. And so then it matches up all the points and images that it can recognize across these hundreds of images and creates a dense point cloud, which is what you're seeing in this picture. So it's made up of a whole bunch of points, and where there are gaps or places that the camera couldn't see. Then from that, it will construct a surface model and stitch the images together to make this one single image that we can export. So here's an example of what the digital surface model looks like in this software for that area. And so the red areas are the highest elevation at the tops of the trees here, and the blues are the lowest elevation. So this is the ground surface at the lowest point. And so we're looking at the tops of a bunch of trees here in this picture. In this case, we're flying at about 200 feet altitude and just did a single path. It was a 19-centimeter ground resolution, but when we fly more intricate missions, we can get to ground resolutions less than 3 centimeters. Then we can use, for example, if we have this multispectral capability, we can compute vegetation indices and then each point in this dense point cloud or in however you output the data can be related to vegetation vigor, for example. So here the yellows are active photosynthesizing vegetation, and then the blues are areas that are probably brown at this time of year. So here's an example of what it might look like. This is from the consumer grade true color setup. So just to give you a sense, this is at the Hudson Biological Reserve. It's a WSU research property here in Eastern Washington. And you can see there's a clump of willow trees here. We can delineate the edge of the stream. We can see the grasses and forbs at the edge of the stream. The three-dimensional surface that comes out of this has some roughness to it. So you see the road is mostly smooth, but there are some bumps there to give you a sense of what the noise is that we get from this. But we can also still see the shape of the stream channel, keeping in mind that we're seeing the top of the vegetation, not the top of the ground surface here. And then here I just put a transparent of the color image over the DEM to give you a sense of what that looks like. In this example, this is about 5 acres of a riparian buffer. There are some young ponderosa pines along the western shore and a couple of taller, older ponderosas on the eastern here. In this case, we did set the ground control points and tried to get as accurate as we could, flying at the altitude we needed to fly at with this setup. And this is what we get as an output. So at any one of these points in a GIS, we can go in and get the height and also the values of red, green, and blue at those points. This is another set of example images just to compare side by side a couple different sensors. So on the left, we have a GoPro that was flying pretty low, 27 to 35 meters altitude. And on the right, this is the commercial grade sensor flying at 50 meters altitude, so quite a bit higher. Just to give you a sense of what you can see in these images. When we stitch the ortho mosaic together, we still have this much visual resolution throughout the area. And this is when it starts to get fuzzy when we zoom in. And also to point out that if the wind is blowing at all, things are a bit breezy, we might get some blurring also. So here are some of the outputs from the entire area that we flew in that particular riparian area. And so all of these are from that one flight, maybe took 1 hour in the field and 1 hour of processing or so with the commercial grade setup that we have. So we can get a true color image where we really see the green riparian area popping out and brown away from that area. Color infrared, so this is analogous to the imagery I showed in the beginning that was the NAPE or satellite imagery. And then we can do different vegetation indices. So in this case, the NDVI shows the whole riparian area just kind of being bright white. It gets saturated pretty quickly. So we could use that red edge band I mentioned and get a little bit more sense of what the three-dimensional structure is of the vegetation in that area. So this is a normalized difference red edge index in the bottom right. Here's another example of an area that's different. It's a mowed grassy area with trees of mixed ages. And I also really wanted to include it as an example because it was in October, where even when we flew near solar noon, there were pretty substantial shadows from the trees. So this is pretty much the end limit for time of year that I would try to monitor vegetation in this part of the world. But you can still see that we could construct this surface model, and it even covers the places that are shown to be shadowed by in the color image. So so when we fly and take lots of pictures from lots of different angles, we can still get this three-dimensional structure even through the shadows. You'll notice in the lower right, the color infrared is pretty muted here because the trees are getting to the end of their season. Just to give you a sense of how much resolution we get when we zoom in, this was flown at 50 to 60 meters altitude to safely clear all the trees in the area. We zoom into that area on the next page. You can still see we get pretty good resolution of the ground when we zoom in. I included this example to show how topography interacts with this. So in this case, we're at the bottom of a canyon, and in the right part of this image, the canyon wall is actually higher than the tops of the trees that we're imaging in this riparian area. So we can do this structure for motion photogrammetry and get topographic information, and we can still capture what's happening with the vegetation even despite the topography. So the road here is at the bottom of the canyon that I just wanted to mention. Okay, so what did we get from all this experimentation? When is it worth using drones or UAVs? So some of the advantages are we can go collect images at times that we know are key. In this case, we looked at the late part of the growing season where we knew the riparian areas were really popping out. And if we could say the vegetation here is active and healthy throughout the growing season, then we can infer that all those ecosystem functions we want to get out of the vegetation are also happening. And that's a way of showing the health of the ecosystem at that time. Potentially, UAVs can give us access to places that are difficult or costly to visit on foot, or, you know, in the example of the canyon where it could be difficult because of the topography, we can still capture that with a drone. It gives us the flexibility to collect various types of data. So we can do regular true color, we can do multispectral or potentially hyperspectral and get lots of different bands if we really want to distinguish between different types of trees, plants, or get at some of the other types of indices we can use. Also thermal, I've been working more recently, just starting to learn about thermal imaging and potentially in the future drone mounted LiDAR, but not quite yet in the same price range anyway. But these can help fill gaps left by existing or available imagery, such as Landsat, NAEP, Sentinel, and potentially help inform management by getting us pictures when we want them and need them. Also, they can replace more dangerous methods. So some of the state agencies are looking at these to replace helicopter surveys, for example. Okay, so the limitations, of course, much training and experience is needed to fly UAVs safely. And we need FAA certification to fly for research purposes as well. Permission is, of course, a major issue. To gain permission to fly the sites that we flew in 2019, I worked with the Conservation District and they identified folks that would be happy and willing to let us fly the drones there. And that was really great also because I got to interact and learn more about the history and land use of those places. But many people understandably are hesitant to have drones flying over their property, and that is something we always need to be very respectful of. There are numerous safety considerations, many different types of weather conditions or physical hazards, power lines we need to consider, weather, wind, rain, lightning. Any of these things will keep us from flying. Major temperature differences. We did a lot of our flying in hot conditions where we have to think about thermals and turbulence. So there are many things like that that we need to deal with, safe takeoff and landing locations, etc. Unless we have LiDAR capability, we're only seeing the uppermost surface. So if it's really important to see below that surface, I mean, we can get a sense of it with some of our structure from motion and some of our red edge vegetation index, but not the way you can with LiDAR. And sometimes the logistics are really complicated of flying. We need to always work within the battery capacity of our drone missions and always have line of sight and all those sorts of things. So there's a bunch of knowledge and experience that goes into that as well. And then finally, the data processing software, it's proprietary, it can be expensive, requires quite a bit of computing power and training experience. Again, that depends on what you're wanting to use drone imagery for and what you need out of it. Some of the processing is much less intensive, potentially much less expensive, but to do what we did ended up taking quite a bit of that. I wanted to share just a quick image from the thermal camera I've been starting to work with in the Forest Ecosystem Dynamics Lab, and we're experimenting with this now in some forest settings. In the thermal infrared here, the white areas are actually cooler and the black areas are warmer, and so we can see all around the trees just light up in these types of pictures. So just to summarize in a nutshell, we found with drone imagery, we could document greenness and vegetation structure at times of interest for the area we were looking at and really identify taxa, assuming that we had visited on the ground, had some context about what taxa were present. Some of the practical limitations include permission, safety, expertise, and access to the software and hardware, and of course the time to do all this. But put together with ground-based data, we think drone imagery can help address a lot of questions for reporting and adaptive management. So the question is, are these technologies and available imagery ready to be put into work for monitoring? Some of the challenges we could summarize with the word access. Access to the information, access to the skills and expertise, and to the places to fly. So those can all be substantial challenges. Historical controversy over the use of aerial imagery for monitoring is understandable and something we always need to think about. I've been told there's a lot of variable capacity and interest among, for example, conservation districts in getting into this, and numerous practical constraints that we've kind of talked about throughout today. Some of the opportunities, though, are there are a lot of existing platforms and relationships for information sharing, such as this conference. I think if folks are willing and able to share lessons learned, the learning could happen really quickly. There are ongoing collaborations in place, I think, to facilitate all of this. And frameworks for review and evaluation already exist in the way that reporting happens and the way that we work in our peer review process in academia. So I think that that is all pretty much ready to go. So in conclusion, each of these approaches has definite advantages and limitations, and that will all depend on what scale you're looking at, that's grain and extent, what are the conditions at the site, and what's the capacity to implement image collection and analysis or work with partners to accomplish that. Sharing knowledge is essential for developing and implementing robust workflows. And from my point of view, I could not have done any of this without our partnership with the Palouse Conservation District and the people who were willing to let us fly the drone. So I think all of their knowledge of the place guided everything that I did. And so it's not something that we could just do in our ivory tower, as you might say. So I've started hosting the scripts and documentation that we used for the Earth Engine part on GitHub. So anyone is welcome to visit, and please definitely share your feedback if you try to work with it and find anything that's difficult to follow or doesn't work well. I would love to hear. We plan to continue to update that and add to it as we develop. And also as our Earth Engine apps start to go live, we'll be posting links to them there. And we're continuing on this project at WSU. To mention again, I'm working on some forest-related projects and tillage-related, and would be really interested to hear what people are interested in or what other folks have learned through their experiences. So thank you so much for your time, and I hope that people have some questions or comments that they'd like to share, and look forward to talking with you.
Great, thank you, Amanda. Yeah, we'll be, so just feel free to put some questions in the question box or raise your hand and we can unmute you if it's easier to ask it than type it. I guess I could kick off a question. So yeah, so we recently at our district acquired a drone, and over the last kind of year or so, I've been debating amongst myself what way to go with the processing side, because that's the biggest limitation for us. Is like in most districts, is it's hard to get the money to buy the software. It's easy to get the money to find a drone or like that kind of thing. It's just they're like what, $3,000 or something like that. But is there one that you liked best? I know it looked like you use what, Agrosoft, Metashape or whatever.
Yes, we've been using Agrosoft Metashape in our lab because it works well for what all the different researchers there are doing, and it's possibly the best one for doing the structure from motion work. So if you're really trying to get into those three-dimensional models. But if you are looking more at just stitching images together to make a single georeferenced image, then there are, I know Pix4D has some different levels of options, and Agrosoft I think also has some options that have lower capabilities that are more affordable. And I think they also have a trial version. So that's something else that you could consider, is just giving that a try. Another thought is reaching out to us offline. If you had just one project that you wanted us to try to render for you at our lab, we could probably make that happen, just to help you scope out what that would be like. And depending on how often you plan to have images that need to be rendered, I'm curious if there are options for conservation districts to pool their resources, or potentially work with extension, or find some other way to cost share for the access to that, because it seems maybe redundant for multiple districts to have to invest in that in some way, unless they're all doing image processing all the time, then maybe that's not necessary.
Yeah, it's we've definitely thought about that. It's hard to get us to commit to it. Like it's kind of like basically you almost have to take on the subscription for 1 month at a time kind of thing. But I know I've talked about it with some other districts in the past. But yeah, so for us, I mean, you start out and you usually just do the orthophoto stuff, and then you start getting more advanced because you start to learn what else you can do and get more comfortable with it. So thinking about the software that helps you get there is also something, if you can do a one-time investment, but gets us a year from now, we're starting to do that. The more the terrain-based stuff, the photogrammetry side, that's kind of a consideration when we're talking about spending a bunch of money.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's still a lot more affordable than LiDAR, and the processing is much less intensive still. So I guess it depends on what your budget is and what you're comparing to.
Yeah. So we've got a question about, do you know if anyone has used drones to measure shade and stream temperature with drones?
That's something that we have been throwing around the idea of doing. I don't think it's been done extensively. I think maybe there's been a little bit of research into it, but we would like to explore that. So we do have a thermal camera, and we are thinking that we could use temperature sensors in the stream as truthing, water surface truthing, and fly the thermal camera over it, but it's not something that we have actually gotten into yet. But the potential is there, I think.
Yeah, I know when looking at drones, I know Parrot drone has a thermal one built in. Like it's not be able to change out the sensor level. It's literally just a 4K camera and an infrared camera on the same drone. It's a little cheaper than trying to get like a Matrice 600 or whatever. But I had that thought of it'd be kind of cool to fly stream corridors and find cold pockets and all kinds of stuff, but I don't know if it actually works. So
yeah, and the tricky part is, so with thermal, I'm still working with it in our first initial experiments on land. And you want to find a time where there's minimal wind, because you don't want the air moving around too much, right? And then anytime we're flying over a stream, we have to be careful because we have to fly above the canopy. We have to find a safe path to fly. And I know that a colleague of mine who's been flying along rivers and streams has run into problems with birds, thinking that the drone is something invading their territory or food. And so that's another consideration when flying in those areas. But I think, we could try flying in a place that fits the specs first for safe drone flying, and just see how well it does at detecting temperature differences. I think calibrating the thermal drone so that it's giving you temperature as opposed to just relative heat measurements can be pretty intricate, but also if you have the ability to place those sensors in known areas, that you can generate a linear model to make that calibration, and people have reported that it does work. So maybe something in our next steps.
yeah, that's interesting. So are there any other questions folks have for Amanda on the either Google Earth Engine or what she's done with drones? Okay, yeah, so I guess I don't see any more questions. So well, thank you, Amanda, for presenting to us. I think that's really cool. I think it's kind of some of the ways we can get some better. I like using drones for even just the visual side of things for funders, but going the route of using it for longer term repetitive monitoring of sites that as they evolve is also an interesting way to go. So thank you very much. Folks don't have any more questions.